Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the International Lecture Series with Turing and the RSS and hosted by the UK HSA. My name is Johanna Hutchinson. I'm the Director of Analytics and Data Science for the UK Health Security Agency, and it's absolutely my pleasure to welcome you here today to hear our guest speaker, who we'll hear a little more about in a moment, and to hear his amazing lecture. The reason that this international series has come about is because of the essence of collaboration. And collaboration has been an absolute key for ourselves in the UK Health Security Agency and its former organisational partners during the pandemic. And during the pandemic, we coupled very closely with our academic colleagues in Turing and the Royal Statistical Society to actually bring some of the new analytics and insights to bear as this pandemic unfolded. And this international series came about as we had conversations with Chris and with Sylvia and with colleagues on our board and said, how do we get the best of the world to come to us? How do we get to find out more about the great insights from other areas of the world? And this series was born. So let me tell you a little about the UK Health Security Agency. It's a new organisation which came into force on the 1st of October last year. It's an amalgamation of the former Public Health England, of the test and trace operation that existed across England at the time, and the Joint Biosecurity Centre, which was integral within them as a kind of intelligence unit. And when they brought these partners together, there was a real essence here of being able to take forward an organisation that would help us with preparedness and health protection across England in a greater stance going forwards. So what are our pillars of our building blocks, our pillars that we stand by? Let me tell you about the first 5. And the first, as you'll see in everything that we do, is scientific excellence. So this is a professional organisation and is exceptionally science driven. We have strong data analytics and surveillance capability. So here we're looking at high quality all hazard surveillance, data science and analytics. We're building this capability from a central capacity, but also, of course, hoping to be the critical building blocks to support our scientific colleagues in work that they will do going forwards. We've demonstrated through the test and trace programme that grew to the size of Asda, one of our big supermarket chains, and within just a few months that we've got operational agility and flexibility. And we're leading in excellence in agility in that area to be responsive where we need to be, but also pragmatic in terms of how this pandemic goes forwards. We work really closely with international colleagues on global health security and preparedness, and we're international leaders in this particular aspect. We've got many connections abroad and overseas and work really well between different countries to understand exactly what's happening with diseases and threats. We're system leaders in forging partnerships with academia and with industry. That's across the organisation, and today just demonstrates some of that work that we do. And most importantly to our people, because we are a public body, is maximising the social and economic impact of health security. And as we go forward, we'll be working more on really understanding what the economic impact of health protection is on our people. So if you're healthy and you have a healthy nation, how does that impact our economy and help us to go forward to build a stronger UK? I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to hand over to Chris to do introductions to Steve. Really looking forward to your questions at the end, and I hope you enjoy this afternoon's session.
Thanks, Johanna. Welcome, everybody. I'm Chris Holmes. I'm a technical director of the Turing Royal Statistical Society Health Data Lab that partnered with UK HSA and co-sponsoring this event today. I'm also Professor of Statistics at the University of Oxford and Programme Director for Health at the Alan Turing Institute. The Turing RSS Health Data Lab was set up during the pandemic to provide independent additional capacity for research with UK HSA, and we've worked very closely on a number of exciting projects. And one of the things that we've been involved in is the community building events, of which this is a flagship series for us. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who's Steve MacFeely. He's Director of Data and Analytics at the World Health Organization and Adjunct Professor at the Centre for Policy Studies at University College Cork in Ireland. Also Director of the International Association for Statistical Education and the IS Literary Programme. Co-chairs the Committee of the Chief Statisticians of the UN and chairs the Advisory Board of the Statistical Journal of the International Association for Official Statistics. I could go on. He's an elected member of ISI and also a number of lead authorship publications, including Data Strategy of the Secretary General for Action by Everyone, and a lead author on the 2020 System-Wide Roadmap for Innovation, UN Data and Statistics. Steve, we're absolutely delighted to have you here today, who's going to talk to us about understanding the impact of the pandemic, challenges, opportunities, and politics. Steve, over to you.
Great. Well, thanks, Joanna, and thanks, Chris. It's a huge pleasure for me to talk today. I was actually really excited when I got the invitation and I realized it was from the Alan Turing Institute. I mean, how could I say no? I mean, Alan Turing, I think, is a hero to all statisticians ever since I read a book called The Enigma many, many years ago about Turing's life. So yeah, delighted to be here and delighted to explain some of the work that we've been doing both at the World Health Organization and also more broadly across the UN on kind of informing the pandemic. So let me go through the most stressful part of the day, which is to load up my screen, and then hopefully this will work. So I hope now you can see the full screen. So what I'm going to talk today about is kind of looking briefly at the challenges, the opportunities, and some of the politics that have come out of trying to understand the impact of the pandemic from a statistical perspective. Okay, so I'm just trying to get my page to move on. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with a quick reminder, just kind of what happened during the pandemic. I'll say a little about the CTSA response, first of all, which is, it's the Coordination Committee for Statistical Activities, which is really the Chief Statisticians body at the UN and the wider international organizations, and what we did to try and inform events during the pandemic. Then I'll turn our attention more directly to WHO, and in particular, work that we did on trying to measure excess mortality. And then very quickly, I'll wrap up with some kind of issues, and this is really where we get into the politics maybe and some of the implications of the work that we've done. So a quick reminder, it's only 2.5 years ago, but it's amazingly how quickly kind of we forget. So at the end of December, I'm sure you remember, out of China comes the worrying news that there's an unknown strain of pneumonia. Probably at that stage, it wasn't worrying. I think most of us didn't realize the implications of what was coming. But very quickly, if you look at the timeline, and I'm only showing the first 3 months, what we see really, even within the first month, we start seeing cases in Thailand, in Japan, in Korea. And within 20 days of the first reports, WHO starts daily situation reports, which in itself signals that something serious is happening. And at that stage, there's been 282 cases and only 6 deaths. Within a few days of that, we have the first cases in the US and then in France as well. So within a month, really, we see it's already spread outside of Asia. Probably the first really serious moment from a WHO perspective is at the end of the month. So 1 month after the news breaking out of China, WHO declares a FIC, which is a public health emergency of international concern. And this is a formal declaration by the WHO that there's an extraordinary event that constitutes a public health risk, and it could spread disease internationally, but crucially requires a coordinated response. The FIC is the most serious kind of alert that the WHO can issue. So even though there was a lot of discussion later on about pandemic, the word pandemic doesn't have any legal implication, whereas the FIC does. So the public health emergency, really, that's the big red alert call from the WHO that goes out at the end of January. The same day, we see the first reported cases in Italy, and that becomes very significant, as we know. And the very next day, we see the first reported cases here in the UK. A few days later, the disease is baptized. So we have COVID-19, and then we have spreads through Africa, and so on, so on. Then on the 11th of March, probably the one that caught the public's attention more and maybe politically is more serious, even though legally it has no significance, is the WHO declares that COVID-19 is a pandemic. And I think just to round out the first 3 months, we see right at the end of March, Italy already passes the 10,000 COVID deaths. So we see this rapid escalation, which I don't think any of us can forget. This is just some charts just to show in terms of the spread from countries and territories. So we see when the FIC is declared at the end of January, we're looking at around 25 countries. By the time the pandemic is declared a month and a half later, we already have COVID in about 120 countries. And if you look at it from a confirmed cases per day, the same thing, you get to see really the FIC is declared. On this chart, it wouldn't look like things are really that serious at this point. But you can see by the time the pandemic is declared that the trend line is really starting to arc up. So that's what brought us to where we are. So what happened? Well, around this time, at the start of March, I was in New York at the Statistical Commission, whereas, as you may know, the Chief Statisticians of national statistical offices and international organizations meet to try and coordinate statistical activity. At that stage, in very early March, it was becoming clear that something really serious was brewing. And in fact, as I headed home, I cancelled all my meetings, all my travel. The CCSA, which is the group of chief statisticians of the international system, and I've just put out, if you're not familiar who they are, this is really the chief statisticians of all the UN system, and then also other organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, Eurostat, the development banks. There's about 45 members in all. We started discussing kind of what to do about this. So the question was really, we had never done anything like this before. So our question really was, how as a group of international organizations can we make ourselves useful in informing the world about what's happening with COVID? So very quickly, we agreed to start trying to pull together a report. The first report included work from 36 different agencies, including the WHO. And we looked at how COVID was impacting on the world. And this was published, the first report was published within 2 months of the pandemic being declared. That in itself might not sound amazing, but in fact, there was a huge amount of work behind the scenes, because with 36 different agencies with different mandates, there was a lot of legal issues to be sorted out. You know, typically we have different caveats, we have different declarations and reports. We report on different regional aspects. All of these issues had to be ironed out before we could publish. That first report, it has 36 agencies, it has 36 chapters, and it covers impact on health, on economy, on society, regional dimensions, and also impact on statistics. So I'll just show you, I mean, very quickly, just some examples that I think a lot of people know. You could see the impact on tourism was almost immediate, like the tourism and travel market just collapsed. We saw equally the global trade just absolutely stalled as well, in particular merchandise trade, services trade, not so much. So we really saw the economy, the brakes just jamming on. Very shortly afterwards, we see schools starting to close, and in fact, we start to see schools closing locally well before the pandemic was actually declared. And that starts to escalate from localized to national programs. And very quickly, you see right across the world, schools are being closed and millions of children having to be homeschooled. And crucially, I guess more seriously, what we see is for the first time in about 20 years, we see global poverty, or the improvements in global poverty, reversing, and we start to see an increase in global poverty for the first time in a long time. The second report came out a few months later, towards the end of the year. Again, we lost a couple of agencies, we 30 agencies contributing. And at this stage, we start to see more nuanced reporting as kind of deeper impact is starting to be seen. So again, we see stuff like the impact on passenger traffic, but we also now start to see massive losses of employment and loss of hours of employment. So really, really huge impact. We also see huge impact on the economy again. So we think things like foreign direct investment just collapses or stalls as large businesses are waiting to see what happens. And again, crucially, we see a massive reversal in something like the Human Development Index, which really has, it's not showing a steady improvement, but we've seen a general improvement over the years, and suddenly we see a full-scale reversal in the patterns. And of course, that's no surprise, because education and health are two of the main pillars of the Human Development Index, and they're two of the pillars that are really, really impacted by the pandemic. By the time we hit the third report, and in fact, the third report was slightly different in that we also now are trying to make the data available through GitHub. So we're trying to move beyond just a PDF and trying to make all of the data available. Not all agencies manage, but a lot of data is provided. But you can see here, if we compare it to volume 1, now the forecasted deterioration in global poverty is really, really becoming pronounced. So within a year of kind of the pandemic starting to close down schools and economy, we start to see like a really serious social deterioration. So I put in the links to those reports, and again, I think they're well worth looking at. And as I said, probably maybe the more interesting aspect of this report was the fact that so many agencies had managed to come together so quickly to highlight the importance of good health for economy and society. What it also showed was the importance of nowcasting. So timely data is always important, but timely data really, really became crucial as people needed to know what was happening now, because things were changing so fast. But of course, one of the impacts of COVID is it was so disruptive. Many of the nowcasting models that UN agencies used just fell apart under the pressure, because all of the usual covariates, all of the usual models just weren't working. At the time, I was working in UNCTAD, and we had to stop forecasting trade for about 9 months while we frantically rebuilt our models. In WHO, we're going through the same thing now, where we're having to rebuild some of our models, because it's very, very difficult in the absence of timely data and with kind of patterns changing to really nowcast what's been happening. On a more positive side, what we saw was that the cost-benefit calculus really changed around innovation. So a lot of countries who maybe couldn't afford to innovate and develop their statistics, suddenly now that equation changed, and because they were so desperate, they were forced to move maybe away from paper-based surveys to CATI or to CAPI. And again, what we saw even within the CCSA, a lot of the mandate and administrative barriers that would have stopped us publishing reports like we had just published in the past, all of those barriers were swept aside by the need to provide up-to-date, timely, relevant information. So while the pandemic did cause a lot of disruption, we also see it also opened a lot of doors for statistical agencies and for international organizations. For anybody interested in this particular aspect of the presentation, we published a paper some months ago in the Statistical Journal of the IAOS, and that's freely available. And we kind of detailed the story there. So now maybe if we move to more immediate now, to my work, to WHO, and we'll turn our attention to measuring excess mortality. But before that, what I want to do is just draw a distinction between excess mortality and just the reported statistics. So if we begin by what you see in the media every day, the WHO updates a database every day, which gives the confirmed number of cases and the confirmed number of deaths. And as you can see, this is the time series. Now, right now, I'm speaking to you from Ireland, where I can tell you COVID is rampant. But because now the relationship with mortality has decoupled, we certainly in Ireland, we are definitely under-reporting and under-measuring COVID cases. So the COVID cases, I think, that are published daily now, you have to take, I think, globally with a large pinch of salt, because a lot of people are suffering mild or not super serious COVID, but they're not reporting because the implications are less serious. The COVID deaths, again, suffer issues because of either definitional differences. Different countries assess COVID mortality as opposed to any other mortality differently. And there's also general problems with reporting, which I'll talk about in a moment. And you can see here that this is just the cumulative. You can see in the top the kind of jump in the cumulative as we saw that large spike in the time series. COVID hasn't been even across the region. So what we've seen is that Europe and the Americas, according to the statistics that we have been the two regions that have suffered most, both in terms of COVID cases and in terms of COVID mortality. And you can see that clearly here, and you can see it here again. And again, this provoked a lot of discussion, particularly in the context of preparedness. There was several preparedness indices published well in advance of COVID, that they weren't designed for COVID specifically. But what we see is that they were really saying that the US, the UK, various other countries were the best prepared for a health emergency like COVID. And in fact, if you looked at it from a mortality or per capita mortality perspective, they were some of the worst performing. And this raised a lot of questions about like what was going on, why was that, how was this possible? Now, one of the reasons that we need to be careful when we look at those statistics is global death registrations are not good quality data generally. So from a global perspective, what we see is that less than 40% of countries register at least 90% of their deaths, or put it another way, more than 60% of countries don't. And on the right-hand side, you can see that out of 194 countries, only 39, or roughly 20% of countries would be considered to have what we could call high-quality mortality data. For the rest of the world, either the quality is mixed, or in fact, data don't exist at all, or certainly not good quality data. And this really, COVID really highlights the implications of this. This really hit at the Achilles heel of health statistics, because all of the stuff that we're comparing there is impacted by measurement. And as we see, even in developed countries, measurement varied because of different regimes, testing regimes and so forth. But in a lot of countries, there isn't infrastructure in the first place to capture good quality mortality statistics, let alone during a crisis. So this is why WHO and other agencies have turned their attention to excess mortality. Now, I probably don't need to tell anybody here what this is, but just for thoroughness, I think it's worth going through. So excess mortality, in this case associated with COVID-19, is the difference between actual deaths irrespective of the cause. So in other words, all cause for a specific time and place. And that's compared with expected deaths. And those expected deaths are calculated based on historical trends in the absence of COVID-19, or ideally in the absence of any other crisis. So they're meant to be normal standard trends. So then that means excess mortality accounts for both direct and indirect impact of the crisis, in this case, the pandemic. And that at least makes it more objective in that it's counting all of the mortality. So we don't have to worry about the classification of COVID specifically. This isn't a new concept. When we started getting ready to publish this, a lot of countries, I think, misunderstood this and felt that this was something the WHO had just invented, when in fact it's not. It's a long-standing concept, and it's internationally recognized concept, and it's been used by WHO, by academic organizations for many, many years. So basically, we see this as a more comprehensive measure of the total impact of the crisis, as it takes into account all deaths. Now, one of the implications, which I'll talk about towards the end, is what that does mean is it does include a bit of noise that comes in from other events, and I'll give some examples about that later on, but that's unavailable. Now, we talk about excess mortality associated with COVID-19 because obviously it's not a direct causal link. And as I said, obviously there's other things happening in the world at any one time. So we're attributing it, or we're saying it's associated with COVID because COVID at the time was seen as the main cause of excess mortality. So we're kind of attributing it to one thing, if you want, but of course there are many, many other kind of minor causes. Now, one of the challenges in assessing excess mortality at a global level is that, as we just saw, a lot of countries don't have mortality data at all. Then other countries, we have partial data, and by partial that could mean either we have data but it's quite out of date, or we only have it for maybe some regions of a country, or it's in some way incomplete, and that's been signaled to us. So this gives you an indication. So you can see basically in Africa, we classify these as tier 3 countries, which basically meant we had no data. And then the green regions meant tier 2. We didn't have complete data, and even if the countries had data, they weren't giving us access to those data. One of the challenges politically, so this isn't a modeling problem, but politically it was, is some countries took this really as a political classification. So that, you know, they kind of looked at this as if WHO was saying this was some sort of measure of development, which is not what it is at all. It's purely a statement of fact. Purple countries have data, and those data are available to WHO. Green countries may or may not have data, but it has not been made available to WHO. And yellow countries don't have data, and that's all it meant. But in fact, later on, when we got to the consultation phase, this became a very, very political issue. So this just makes the case again. So here you can see the state by region. So you can see, for example, in Europe, which probably has the best quality data, we see 87% of the data would be considered complete. 9% is partial, and then so we have very little. There's only a tiny residual as either don't have data or is mixed quality. Whereas if you contrast that with Africa, it's almost exactly the reverse. We say 87% of data there don't exist. So we have very few countries, really just South Africa and one or two others, that have data, and a few that have partial. And it's mixed across the world. And obviously, this is the single biggest challenge, because if we're going to develop a model, the model by definition is going to be based on countries where we have data, which is really the Americas, and that's primarily North America, and Europe, which are developed countries. And then the big question is, can we extrapolate those patterns to the developing world and to other countries in other hemispheres with other cultural and economic backgrounds? To help us do this, WHO put together a technical advisory group. So Joanne mentioned in her introduction the importance of partnerships, and we would agree completely with that. So what we did is we brought together a technical advisory group, which was really made up, it was a multidisciplinary group: epidemiologists, data scientists, data analysts, statisticians, biostatisticians, demographers, social scientists, national government experts, academics, policymakers, economists. So we had 31 members and over 30 observers. The observers expanded and shrank depending on the time. And this group really helped us to kind of test the models. A lot of the academics brought in a lot of their PhD students. So we ended up getting a huge amount of assistance from outside of WHO to help us crunch the model. The model within WHO was really the main person is a colleague of mine, William Mcfeely, who was kind of our lead technical expert on this, and he worked with the tag kind of day in, day out. And what we were trying to do was to develop a globally standardized model, but that would take into account the specificities or the idiosyncrasies, if you want, of each country. And what we wanted to do was develop excess mortality estimates disaggregated by age and sex for the first 2 years of the pandemic. So just to quickly go through in terms of the terms of reference, there was 3 points, so I'll just read them here. The first was to critically appraise current methodologies on how to measure excess mortality. The second was to develop a comprehensive and a pragmatic and policy relevance set of measurements. So in other words, we wanted this data to be usable. This was more than just an academic exercise. And it had to be done within the UN legal identity agenda. So we had to respect UN boundaries, which is obviously very important. And we wanted to, as far as possible, build on civil registration and vital statistics and identity management systems. So we didn't want to start developing new concepts or new data sources. As far as possible, we wanted to use national data. And then obviously the tag has a kind of a secondary role, which is to kind of review and offer guidance on how this could be developed and improved into the future. So if we look at the methodological approach, there's kind of really 2 components to calculating excess mortality. The first is to develop the counterfactual, if you want, or the expected mortality. So in the absence of COVID-19, what would all-cause mortality look like? And then what would it look like during the pandemic? So for the first part, for the expected, we have countries that have data, and we calculate their expected trend based on historic trends, typically using data from 2015 to 2019. Then for countries that don't have historic data, we had to predict or make projections, and we did those using the estimates that we already have from the global health estimates, and we tended to use data from 2000 to 2019. Those are annual data, and then we then took the patterns from the countries to disaggregate by month, so we wanted to impute kind of seasonal patterns which could have a bearing. Then once we had the expected mortality, we then had to try and estimate the all-cause mortality during the pandemic. And again, there's different approaches here, as you can see. So some countries that have data, then we don't need to model, we just take their data. That generally was the case in European countries where we had good data from Euromomo. But toward the end, I'll just note 1 or 2 exceptions where we had some problems. Then in other countries, we may not have had complete data, but we had subnational data for provinces, for states. This was the case, for example, in India, where we had data for 17 of the 28 states. So we used the regional data to model the national data. So basically going from subnational to national. Then in other countries, we might have had annual data, but we didn't have subannual data. So in those cases, we had to model the monthly aggregates. And that was done conditional on covariates, and I'll talk about them in a minute. And then the trickiest were countries where we had no data. So we had to model all-cause mortality conditional on covariates and expected monthly numbers. And that's what this model is trying to show here. So to do this, we had to use what we call contextually relevant covariates, and we can really break these into two clusters. So one is time varying, and this is obviously particularly important when we're looking at subannual. So things we're looking at here is death rates that have been reported, ratio of cases to tests, in other words, the positivity rates. And then another huge bearing was policy response measures. So in other words, what did countries do during the pandemic? So stringency measures, some like restrictions on public gatherings, insistence on mask wearing, and also other containment measures like not allowing travel, closing borders, or in some countries actually preventing people from leaving their house at all. Then for countries where we had no data or little data, we really had to use time invariant covariates. These were more general. So this was things like the relationship to income, to the Human Development Index, to diabetes, to cardiovascular mortality rates, and then the distribution of the age population. So how many people were young and how many people were old. Now, just to say, I mean, there was thousands and thousands of covariates tested before we settled on these and different combinations. So it took a long time for us to settle on this, what looks like a rather simple list. So what did it say? Well, a summary of the results is really here. So what we see is for the first 24 months of COVID-19, the reported estimates were 5.4 million. And our estimates, or the mean estimate, was 14.9 million. And there was a kind of an 11% range around that. So we were saying really somewhere between 13.3 and 16.6 million is what we estimate COVID excess mortality. In particular, you can see on the left-hand side, the real gap emerges in 2021. So while there was significant excess mortality in 2020, the real damage happens in 2021. And in fact, there's a very clear regional dimension to this, which we'll come to. So WHO, as I mentioned, had a technical advisory group. We had members from The Economist and from IHME who had already published estimates. So we were able to learn a lot from their experiences with their modeling. But in fact, we see at the end, we come up with a more conservative estimate than the other two. So the IHME and The Economist estimate are much higher. Although you'll notice the range around the Economist estimate is very, very large and quite significant on the downside. So we fall well within that kind of confidence interval, but quite different to the IHME estimate. The other thing we see, which again has a political dimension, is excess mortality presents quite a graphic geographic redistribution of mortality globally. So what we see, so that this is share of mortality. So if you look at the blue bars are showing the distribution of reported mortality by region, and we see the Americas and the Euro regions really accounting for the lion's share for about, I think it's about 73%. 75% of mortality due to reported cases. But in fact, when we switch to excess mortality, that distribution changes quite a bit. And now we see the Americas and Europe contributing a smaller share. But what we really see is Southeast Asia contributing now a massive share. And unfortunately, some countries took this as a deliberate political they saw this redistribution not as just a technical redistribution from a different indicator, but as being politically motivated in trying to shift emphasis away from the developed world and shift more emphasis, or blame, if you want, onto the developing world. I would say this was particularly unhelpful, but as I said, in one or two cases, this is what countries accuse WHO of doing. If we look at the regions, then we can see the changes. So this is looking at it by geographic region. This is the difference between reported and excess mortality. And you can see that there's some quite graphic differences. For me, much more interesting is when you look at the difference by income group. Why I say this is much more interesting, I think, is what you can see. I think what this is very telling, because it tells us a lot about measurement. And we can see in high income countries where, again, we see reporting is much more sophisticated and developed, that the difference between reported and excess mortality is much, much smaller. As we move into middle income countries, we see that difference starting to get larger. And when we move into lower income countries, we see the difference is really stark. And I think this really tells us a lot about the statistical systems as much as it does about the pandemic itself. So one of the questions that we were asked was, well, why is global excess mortality so important? Why are you doing this? And in particular, why are you doing it now, right in the middle of a pandemic? Some countries said, look, we're busy with other stuff. The last thing we need is this. So we were trying to make the case that why this is important is, well, first of all, we are charged with producing global health estimates every year, which tries to measure the overall and cause-specific burden of mortality. We cannot do that if we don't have a global envelope to work from. So the first thing we needed to do was figure out what is excess mortality. As I said at the start, excess mortality is all-cause mortality. We are now working at the moment to try and distribute that all-cause mortality into cause-specific burden, which we hope to produce toward the end of the year. I imagine that's politically sensitive too, but for the moment, we don't have to worry about it because we haven't done it yet. But that's what we're working on. Those global health estimates, they're also the foundation for a lot of other indicators that we produce as standards. So everything from premature mortality, neonatal child maternal mortality, suicides, road traffic accidents, air pollution, poisoning, wash, all of those things we cannot produce if we don't have a mortality estimate. We can't produce life expectancy or healthy life expectancy estimates without a mortality estimate. So these numbers were really, really critical to a lot of other work. I think this work is also important more politically because now there's a lot more attention has been shifted to global preparedness, pandemic preparedness. And I think if we're going to think about preparedness, one of the things we need to think about is what are the metrics of success or failure? And I think, as we've seen, global excess mortality is probably one of the measures that we should include, not just reported estimates, because as we've seen, reported estimates have quite a few problems. And then crucially, the UN itself also needed these estimates because they needed to update global population estimates and global population projections. And this is where the age and gender really becomes critical. I mean, apart from kind of child mortality and things like that, they really needed to understand the impact, particularly on females of fertile age, because if there was an impact there of significance, that would have an impact for population projections. Now, I mentioned at the start that what we're talking about here is global excess mortality associated with COVID-19. But of course, in individual countries, there's other stuff happening. And one good example was Armenia. So while we've published excess mortality associated with COVID-19, and we're only saying COVID-19, in fact, what we know is that in 2020, at least 6,000 deaths were directly attributable to armed conflict. So they had nothing to do with COVID at all. But yet we've bundled them into the COVID-19 excess mortality estimate. And that's because at a global level, that makes sense. But of course, at individual country level, it doesn't necessarily make sense. And that's why the work that we're doing now to attribute it to specific cause mortality is really important. Obviously, Armenia weren't happy with our estimates, and they were really keen that we make this distinction. And in fact, the next iteration that we report, we will try and make this more clear. This, of course, is going to be very important this year because the estimates that we published for the first half of 2022, we will also have the complications now of conflict in Ukraine, which is affecting Ukraine and Russia. And now, as we see, we also have a heat wave. And already we're seeing in France and Spain, Portugal, that there's a large number of excess mortality being reported associated just with the heat wave. So these are things that we're going to have to grapple with in the next edition and make those more clear. We also made a couple of mistakes. So probably the most noticeable was between Germany and Sweden. We had two issues here, which are basically similar to both countries. One was when we were extrapolating the historic to the current, we were using a method called spline. And there was a lot of debate about whether we should be using a linear extrapolation or a spline. That contributed, but for sure, actually the biggest problem in both cases wasn't, while the methodology contributed, the biggest case was actually we were using the wrong data set. The WHO does a lot of work does a lot of consultation with countries, and we ask countries to validate their estimates. But in the case of both Germany and Sweden, the estimates that had been validated weren't in fact the estimates that were being published by the country. And we only realized this once we'd published the data. So what we see is when we put in the revised estimates, which these haven't been published yet, but they'll be published in the next edition. What we see is there'll be a downward estimate of the German estimates, and the Swedish estimates will increase slightly. So in both cases, these were well within the margin of error that we published. They both were about a 3% error, but nevertheless, those errors attracted a lot of attention, and WHO shipped quite a bit of criticism, which is fair enough. But we don't have any problem with that per se. We'll make that very clear. We'll make the revision clear in the next estimate, and that's fine. That's just science. Occasionally, we mess up. Another country I'd like to just comment on briefly is India. India, as you may know, it got a lot of attention, was very publicly critical both of the model and of WHO's right even to produce these estimates. The main criticism, unfortunately, from India wasn't well informed, despite numerous attempts to assist them to understand the model. So publicly, at least, what their main criticism of the model was that we were using patterns and estimates from other countries to extrapolate and model India's estimates. But in fact, that wasn't the case at all. As I've said, in countries where we had regional data, we used regional data to extrapolate to the national data. In the case of India, we had, as far as we could tell, good data directly from 17 of the 28 regions. And in fact, those regions account for roughly about 2/3 of the population. And if we look at historic data, those regions accounted for about 66% of mortality. In fact, what we did afterwards is we took out the 2020 data and modeled it just using the 2019. And in fact, we got very, very similar estimates to what the data that were actually reported. So in the case of India, in actual fact, only about 34% of the data are modeled. And this is something that we really struggled to explain to India, which is unfortunate because obviously they were one of the most important countries in terms of contributing to excess mortality, particularly in 2021. So just to wrap up, just to kind of discuss a few possible legacies or some thoughts arising from this. So one, obviously, is COVID-19 has really highlighted the importance of health and health statistics. But what it really did is, I think, or at least I hope it did, is it highlighted the weakness of CRVS, or civil registrations and vital statistics data in many, many countries. WHO has been highlighting this for years, but I hope that the pandemic has really hammered home to member states the weakness of their systems, but also why this is important. And in the next slide, I'll just touch on that briefly. What it also did, though, is it also exposed the institutional weakness of official international statistics. So, for example, if you take the case of the UK, the ONS is recognized as being an independent, impartial statistical agency, but it's a specialized statistical agency. One of the challenges we have at international level is data from nations are then transmitted to international organizations, which really, with the exception of Eurostat, are not statistical agencies. They're political entities which have a statistical entity within them. And what we saw in the case of excess mortality is that those statistics very, very quickly became politicized. And being brutally honest, it wasn't clear for quite some time whether WHO would publish these estimates or not. We were being challenged, our mandate was being challenged, and it was a real testament, I think, to Dr. Tedros that he stood up and we published these estimates. I think it was a really, really important test case. But other international organizations have faced similar challenges, and I think now there's growing concern and there's going to be growing focus on the institutional weaknesses of statistical systems within international organizations. We also saw differences in attitude. So when we did consultations, we did consultations both with national statistical offices through the Statistical Commission, but also through the Ministries of Health. And what that really highlighted was, well, two things really. One was the lack of coordination within countries, where maybe the National Statistical Office looked at the model and said, yeah, that's fine. And then the Ministry of Health looked at the results and said, no, we don't like the results, and tended not to focus on the model as much. And I think this also highlighted that really the difference between ministries and NSOs, both in terms of statistical literacy, but also on independence and impartiality. And that's a challenge, especially for a specialized agency like WHO that deals primarily with the ministries. Now, one of the things that we're in the process now of setting up is a new international conference on health statistics, where we hope to bring NSOs and ministries together to discuss these and other issues so that all of the players are in the one place at the same time. If I come back to point 2 about the institutional weakness, at the Statistical Commission this year, there was a new resolution that's been put to ECOSOC. And for the first time, we see the emphasis now being placed on global statistical systems, whereas traditionally this always would have been on national statistical systems. And that shift is very deliberate, and it's done because the Statistical Commission and professional statisticians are growing concerned about the politicization of statistics, and in particular, the politicization within the UN or international system. Other things that also highlighted is there's now a clear tension between model data and reported data. And I think there is a growing shift in emphasis. I think for a long time, countries were quite happy to report data, and then if we model data, that was okay. But I think now countries are beginning to realize this is impacting on data sovereignty, that they're losing control maybe of the messaging. So they're becoming more apprehensive about modeled estimates. Then equally on the international side, we're always concerned about modeled estimates because assuming the data come from countries are robust, then modeled estimates are never going to be as good, we think, as reported estimates. And the other problem sometimes with modeled estimates is they mask the extent of the problem. So in other words, if we produce modeled estimates, even if we call them modeled estimates, we then produce estimates for all countries. It's not clear then, and certainly we've been deficient in making this clear, is that a lot of those countries don't have data. And so in a way, we're papering over the cracks and we're hiding the problem. And I think certainly on WHO dashboards, it's something we're now considering is how to present model data, but also to present kind of a visualization of the metadata. So users can see straight away how much of that information is modeled and isn't actually based on reported information. And then finally, some of this maybe sounds a little bit negative, but there has, as I said, there has been some very positive legacies coming out of the pandemic, and we've seen a dramatic shift in gear around innovation. I think a lot of the traditional barriers, whether cultural, whether administrative, some of them have been swept aside, that people have realized, okay, we need more timely information, and maybe the way that we're collecting or compiling data, that model isn't fit for purpose anymore, and we need to really consider and be more open to new options, whether it's citizen science, whether it's big data, whether it's new types of models, that we really need to open our minds and kind of consider everything before we reject them. So just very quickly, I just mentioned the importance of CRVS, and I just want to make one kind of important point just before I finish. And this is really kind of about de-siloing issues. So the pandemic really highlighted the cross-cutting nature of health. But when we look at CRVS, I mean, traditionally, WHO has argued about the importance of CRVS from a health perspective. But in fact, if we step back and we look at CRVS from a higher elevation, in fact, what we see, CRVS is obviously very important for measuring mortality, for life expectancy, but it's hugely important from an economic perspective, because if at the UN more broadly, we're trying to encourage countries to formalize their economies. If you don't know who your population are, then you can't tax them. You can't formalize those economies. So CRVS is it's the critical first step towards formalizing economies. Obviously, it has a huge human rights dimension in terms of identities in documenting populations. And again, that has implications for marriage, for employment. It has massive implications for democracy, obviously, both in terms of running elections, but also in terms of determining electoral boundaries. Again, if you don't know who your population are and where they are, it's very hard to avoid double counting. There's huge issues around transference of property, about inheritance, especially on the mortality side. If you don't know if somebody is dead, if it's not well defined. That has implications for planning, for statistics. Increasingly, we see it has implications for security in the context now of kind of growing concerns around terrorism. And more broadly, we see a focus on gender, and that really cuts across all the stuff I was talking about legitimacy, about property rights, about inheritance. CRVS is crucial if we really want to have kind of gender equality for populations. So, and I think this is something that WHO is now starting to realize, that when we talk about CRVS, we have to broaden the discussion beyond health and talk about it from a much more holistic point of view. So we shouldn't necessarily be talking about this to the Ministry of Health. We should be talking about this to central government, because this is a whole of government issue. So with that, I will stop. So thank you very, very much for your attention.
Thank you, Steve. Brilliant. Yeah, thank you from everybody listening in. Fascinating presentation. There are a few questions in the chat, and I'll hang around and kind of marshal those. I appreciate that others will need to kind of drop off, but first one, and maybe just quickly, was a question about whether code and whether data is available. Is it publicly available for people to download?
Yeah, we've made everything available on the website. You can get all the data. We've put a lot of stuff up on GitHub as well. And we'll continue to do so. I mean, this is a work in progress, so each iteration will include revisions. So again, we're very eager to get feedback. And just on the tag, just for the Alan Turing Society as well, just to note, people are more than welcome to join. So if people are interested in this type of area and think they can contribute, or would just like to get involved, that they can apply to join the tag as well, where they get access to obviously everything.
Great, thank you. That's good to hear, and yeah, really encourage people to take you up on that. There was a question about your choice of covariates and how do you choose covariates that goes into the model. And if I can add to that as well, a kind of a question was was the way you chose the objective function for choosing covariates, was that pre-specified, or was it something that you had to adapt to as you went through the analysis?
Yeah, it was iterative. I mean, you're really starting with first of all, what data exist and what data exist in what countries. I mean, that's always one of the biggest constraints. So that there's things that you think might be interesting, but then you don't have the data. And then, as I said, we tested a lot of different covariates, and so I mean, we really settled on what we thought was the most useful, while trying to be parsimonious at the same time. Like, we were trying to keep the model as simple as we could, as robust as we could, and again, we were trying to use official statistics, or statistics that were publicly available, so that people could see what these data were, where they were coming from.
I see.
I don't know if that answers the...
Yeah, no, it's very clear. There's another question here about the effect of delayed reporting on mortality. And again, I'm going to add an additional comment on that, is that if the kind of counterfactual, if I've understood it right, on the excess mortality is what would have happened if there hadn't been a pandemic, what I noted earlier on is, of course, this rather dramatic increase in poverty that was a consequence. And firstly, how does that get kind of absorbed into the excess mortality? And secondly, we know poverty is going to have a long-term effect, or could have a long-term effect on excess mortality as that kind of flows through into the system. So could you comment on, first of all, the question about the delayed reporting of mortality, and secondly, about the longer-term impacts of the pandemic?
Yeah, well, the delays are always problematic, and that's one of the biggest challenges we have, is data comes through to different countries at different speeds. So for 2020, so for example, this year when we published the first 24 months, in some countries we have most of those monthly data, in other countries we've less. So it's always a problem that's lurking in the background, because the seasonality is having an effect. The other thing, what was I going to say? There was something. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of noise within it as well. I mean, because one of the issues we've had to grapple with is what you could call accelerated mortality. So there's a lot of people included in the excess mortality estimates, and you could argue, especially in the older cohort, well, some of them may have died anyway, or they may have died in 6 months' time. So is there a kind of a bias there, in that it's pushing up the numbers of excess mortality, because that would have happened anyway? So there's a lot of stuff in there that, I mean, if William was here, he'd be better able to explain the intricacies of the model, but there was a lot of issues like that we had to kind of deal with and try and figure out, well, how do we balance this off against something else? And that's the joy of the tag, I think. Like, if you've got 30 people and 30 different opinions, in a lot of cases, it's a kind of a compromise. You know, you're trading off, like any model, you're trading off 2 or 3 different things, and you settle on what you hope is the best compromise.
Thank you. So there's a couple of questions actually related to the kind of the model fit in, which was one is a kind of a question when you say, there's a question, is a good model fit necessarily kind of a good predictive model? I think that's one question. How do those two? It's interesting. And the other one is about how do you measure, I guess, calibration under or over prediction?
Yeah, I mean, this is the real question. I mean, as I said, when you're constructing the model, most of the data that you have comes from the developed world. And that's the biggest concern about the predictive quality of it, because then you're trying to extrapolate that to different socioeconomic conditions, but also different climatic, different hemisphere in most cases. So that was a huge challenge. And in fact, in the kind of political arena, if I can call it that, that really becomes the big issue. Countries that are unhappy with either the model or the estimate, that's really the issue that they bring up all the time. And it's a fair question. Now, let me put it this way, that in India, where we have regional data at least. So, and when you look at the map, you can see the regional data are quite geographically dispersed. So we have data from the south, from the north, from the east to west. So we kind of cover the subcontinent. All of the data that's come out subsequently from their own census, from other estimates, they have all pretty much supported the estimates that we have. So it does appear from any external source that we have that the model in India is predicting quite well the excess mortality in India. But that's India. I mean, in a lot of other countries, we don't really have an external validation because we're really struggling. And unfortunately, in a lot of countries, one of the best sources might have been the census. But because of COVID, like 2020, 2021 were meant to be the decennial census years globally. But in a lot of countries, census were postponed in countries because of the pandemic. So a lot of countries now are only doing their census now. So in a lot of countries, we've asked them to put in questions about mortality. Some have been able to, so we may get some additional validation in the future. But in a lot of countries, unfortunately, it's very hard to test the predictive power of the model from kind of a robust external source.
Thank you. Kind of maybe final question, if I can take kind of chair's privilege, which is the politicization of the statistics. Of course, we wish to hold our governments to account on the pandemic response. So it is always going to be, anytime you develop a measure, a metric, people will compare actions and policy against that. Do you see a future where we can kind of depoliticize it, if that's a correct word, or how do you see the progress in terms of future preparedness on the statistics?
Well, I think there's 2 different questions there, Chris. So on preparedness, there's a lot of talk now around preparedness, post-pandemic. And my one concern with preparedness is maybe a kind of an over-reliance on indicators. The idea is that we build a basket of indicators and then we're prepared. There's an expression that generals always fight the last war. My fear is that statisticians may fall into the same trap. Whatever comes next will be different. And I don't think there's any shortcut to just, okay, the more robust data, the better. But I think just having analytical capacity is crucial. You can't get away, like the idea that we select a basket of indicators, that may be helpful and may be illuminating to a point, but I don't think we can call that preparedness. And my worry there is that it creates this kind of comfort blanket that people feel reassured that we've selected this set of indicators and now we're okay. I don't subscribe to that view. I worry about that kind of rhetoric. In terms of the politicization, I think that's an ongoing struggle. And obviously, like, we're a member state driven organization. So it's crucial that member states have a say and drive the United Nations and drive the WHO. So we can't stand apart and kind of say, well, no, we're just doing this. But at the same time, we want to facilitate a conversation where, in particular, in the case of a pandemic, I mean, I think countries do have a responsibility to each other. In the case where a disease is transmissible, I think there is a case where, in some cases, statistics should be produced, whether they're modeled. And so, for example, I mean, to cut to the chase, I would defend our right to produce the global health estimates and the global excess mortality. I think it was really important. It really upset some countries, and I understand that, and we're working with those countries to try and explain to them why it's important that we did it. But at the same time, I understand their concerns, especially in the developing world, where we're really relying on a model. And, you know, and I understand that can cause discomfort for them. And right in the middle of a pandemic, they probably needed it like a hole in the head. So there's two sides to it. So you're trying to manage both as best you can. But as far as possible, I mean, what we're trying to reassure them is what we're doing is science-based as best as we can. We didn't have an agenda other than providing information that could be useful to member states to inform future policies and maybe save future lives.
Thank you. Great closing comments. And again, Steve, a huge appreciation for coming today. And thank you to the audience for listening to such a fascinating talk. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again for the invitation.
Bye-bye.